For years, Moscow was treated as untouchable, the place where wars were directed, not felt. Then, something strange began happening in the night sky. No explosions, no collapsing buildings, no dramatic headlines, yet the sirens never stopped. Air defenses kept firing, airports froze, costs quietly skyrocketed, and just when officials insisted everything was under control, the pattern became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a failed defense. It was something far more unsettling, an operation unlike anything seen before, until the footage emerged. Ukraine's objective in this phase of the war is not to win individual engagements or to overwhelm Moscow's air defenses in a single dramatic moment. It is to control time itself. What looks on the surface like a series of small, easily intercepted drone intrusions is in reality a campaign designed to occupy the defender's calendar, attention, and endurance. Instead of concentrating power into one decisive strike, Ukraine stretches pressure across nights, forcing Moscow's defensive system to remain permanently engaged. Each alert resets the clock. Each interception consumes not just a missile, but a full cycle of detection, authorization, launch, assessment, and recovery. In this model, warfare is no longer measured by what is destroyed, but by how long the defender is denied rest, recovery, and psychological distance from the threat. Time becomes the battlefield, because time is the one resource air defense systems cannot regenerate quickly. A missile can be replaced, radar repaired, crews rotated, but not instantly, and not without cost. Every night Moscow spends on high alert is a night it cannot fully reset its systems or its people. Fatigue accumulates quietly, compounding across operators, commanders, and support staff. The human mind degrades under repetition long before hardware visibly fails. Ukraine's drones exploit this reality by arriving not in overwhelming numbers, but with relentless regularity, ensuring the defensive cycle never truly ends. This marks a doctrinal shift away from strike effectiveness toward reaction saturation. Success is no longer defined by penetrating the shield, but by forcing the shield to work continuously. Even a perfect defense becomes a burden when it must perform without pause. Ukraine is effectively converting Moscow's strength, its layered air defenses, into a liability by compelling them to remain active night after night. In doing so, Ukraine reframes victory not as a breakthrough, but as endurance imbalance. The question is no longer whether Moscow can intercept drones. It is how long Moscow can afford to keep doing so, emotionally, mechanically, and financially, without the luxury of time to recover. What makes this campaign particularly effective is not the noise of explosions or the spectacle of fire in the sky, but the quiet way repetition transforms emergency into routine. Sirens that once jolted attention begin to blend into the background. Radar activations that once signaled crisis become procedural. Interceptions that initially carried urgency slowly turn into checklists. This is where damage accumulates, not through panic, but through normalization. When a society adapts to constant alerts, it does not become stronger, it becomes dulled. Attention shortens, emotional reserves thin, institutions continue to function, but with less sharpness, less urgency, and more friction than before. Habituation is far more corrosive than fear. Fear triggers action and focus, but habituation breeds indifference and fatigue. When abnormal events become expected, they stop mobilizing the same level of response. To achieve the same effect, the state must expend more resources, enforce tighter controls, and apply greater pressure just to maintain baseline stability. Over time, this creates a widening gap between effort and outcome. The system works harder simply to feel normal again. That invisible tax compounds across public services, security forces, and civilian life, even when no single night feels decisive. This is the strategic value of repetition. By forcing Moscow to live with constant alerts rather than isolated shocks, Ukraine alters the psychological terrain. The capital does not collapse, but it adjusts, and that adjustment carries a cost. The sense of exception fades. The idea that war is something distant quietly erodes. Normal life continues, but with interruptions, unease, and a persistent awareness that stability now requires constant vigilance. Power still exists, control is still asserted, yet both feel heavier to maintain than before. Some will see this approach as a risky gamble that relies too much on slow-burning effects rather than decisive outcomes. Others may argue it is the only viable option against a stronger opponent, precisely because it avoids dramatic escalation while steadily reshaping perceptions and pressure. Where you fall on that question depends on how you believe wars are ultimately won. Share your perspective in the comments below. At the core of this campaign lies a form of warfare that does not rely on destruction, but on accounting. The true strike is economic, and the imbalance in cost is not an unfortunate byproduct. It is the weapon itself. Ukraine is deliberately exploiting the gap between what it spends to initiate an attack and what Moscow must spend to stop it. A single drone may cost a few tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes less. The response it provokes, however, often involves interceptor missiles, radar activation, aviation disruptions, and full air defense crews operating at maximum readiness. Even when every drone is intercepted, the exchange still favors the attacker. This dynamic inverts the traditional logic of air defense. Normally, interception equals success. Here, interception becomes expensive compliance. Each defensive action drains resources that are far harder to replace than the drones that triggered the response. Interceptor missiles are not only costly, they are complex, slow to manufacture, and tied to supply chains already under strain. Radar systems consume energy and accumulate wear. Personnel require pay, rotation, and recovery. The entire ecosystem of defense must activate to stop something intentionally cheap and expendable. Over time, repetition transforms this imbalance into systemic pressure. A single interception is manageable. Dozens across multiple nights begin to reshape budgets, logistics, and priorities. Money allocated to future operations, modernization, or strategic reserves is quietly redirected into nightly defense just to maintain the status quo. The defender wins tactically, but loses economically, one engagement at a time. The shield still holds, yet it bleeds value with every activation. Under sustained pressure, air defense stops functioning purely as protection and starts acting as a liability amplifier. The more reliable and responsive it is, the more expensive it becomes to operate continuously. Ukraine does not need to break through the shield to impose damage. It only needs to force the shield to work. In this framework, resilience itself becomes costly, and endurance becomes a financial test rather than a military one. Victory is no longer defined by penetration, but by which side can afford to keep playing the exchange the longest. One of the most consequential effects of this campaign is unfolding far from missile batteries and radar screens, inside the routines of civil aviation. Airports become strategic nodes not because they are struck, but because they are vulnerable to uncertainty. The experience around hubs like Vnukovo Airport demonstrates how the mere presence of an airborne threat can effectively neutralize infrastructure without a single direct hit. When drones appear on radar near civilian air corridors, the system reacts automatically. Flights divert, approaches are aborted, departures are delayed, and ground operations slow to a crawl. The airport remains physically intact, yet functionally degraded. The economic damage from these disruptions rarely announces itself in dramatic figures. It accumulates quietly. Each delay ripples outward through crew scheduling, aircraft rotation, fuel consumption, and maintenance planning. A single diversion forces crews toward duty time limits, triggering replacement costs and cascading schedule changes across entire fleets. Aircraft burn fuel holding or rerouting, incur unexpected landing fees, and miss tightly sequenced slots elsewhere in the network. None of these losses appear catastrophic on their own, but together, they form a steady financial bleed that is difficult to isolate and even harder to stop. What makes this pressure especially effective is that it operates below traditional escalation thresholds. Civilian airports are not attacked. No runways are cratered. No terminals are destroyed. Yet the economic impact is real, persistent, and systemic. Airlines absorb costs. Passengers lose confidence in reliability, and regulators are forced into repeated precautionary measures. The defender must choose safety every time, because the cost of being wrong even once is unacceptable. That asymmetry gives the attacker leverage without inviting the political backlash that accompanies direct civilian casualties. In this environment, aviation becomes a silent casualty domain of modern warfare. The damage is not measured in wreckage, but in lost efficiency, rising costs, and constant friction across a system designed for precision timing. Ukraine's approach reveals how modern economies can be pressured through their connective tissue. By turning uncertainty into a weapon, it demonstrates that infrastructure does not need to be destroyed to be neutralized. It only needs to be made unreliable, often enough that normal operation becomes impossible to sustain. One of the least visible, yet most consequential pressures in this campaign falls not on machines, but on the people operating them. Air defense systems are often discussed as technical marvels, radars, interceptors, command networks, but they are ultimately human systems. Under conditions of constant alert, it is human judgment that begins to degrade long before hardware shows obvious signs of failure. Continuous readiness erodes concentration, shortens reaction windows, and dulls the clarity required for high-stakes decisions. The system may appear intact on paper, but its effectiveness depends on operators who are increasingly tired, overstretched, and mentally saturated. Fatigue does not announce itself with dramatic breakdowns. It manifests subtly through delayed recognition, minor miscalculations, and reduced confidence in split-second choices. In prolonged high-readiness environments, fatigue-driven errors are not anomalies. They are statistical inevitabilities. No amount of training or discipline can fully eliminate the cognitive costs of repeated night alerts, fragmented sleep cycles, and constant anticipation of threat. Over time, decision quality decays in ways that are difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Even small lapses carry outsized risk in air defense, where every contact demands rapid evaluation under uncertainty. Ukraine's approach implicitly exploits this reality. The objective is not to cause interception failure in a technical sense, but to strain the human decision loop that sustains the defensive system. Each drone forces operators through the same mental sequence: detect, classify, confirm, authorize, engage again and again, night after night. The burden accumulates, not in missile expenditure alone, but in cognitive load. As fatigue deepens, the margin for error narrows, and the cost of maintaining perfection rises. There is no single correct interpretation here. Some professionals might argue that disciplined rotation and redundancy can offset human fatigue indefinitely. Others would counter that no system relying on sustained human vigilance can operate at peak performance without degradation. What is clear is that this campaign shifts the battlefield into the human dimension of warfare, where endurance is measured not only in equipment readiness, but in mental resilience. Different analysts and practitioners will likely view this moment through very different lenses, depending on their experience and assumptions about how long people can be asked to operate without relief. In modern conflict, what is not said can matter as much as what is announced. One of the most telling developments in this campaign is not found in explosions or intercepted drones, but in the sudden absence of updated official figures. When authorities stop releasing numbers, it does not necessarily indicate that operations have ceased or that control has been lost on the battlefield. More often, it signals something subtler: strain over narrative control. Information, like airspace, becomes contested terrain. The decision to remain silent is rarely neutral. It reflects an internal calculation about what can be acknowledged without undermining credibility. When official updates slow or disappear, uncertainty fills the gap. Observers begin to infer scale from secondary indicators: air defense activity, aviation disruptions, radar usage, logistical strain. Silence invites speculation, and speculation weakens the authority of prior statements. In this sense, withholding data becomes a defensive posture, one that attempts to contain perception rather than clarify reality. Yet that posture carries its own cost. The longer numbers lag behind events, the harder it becomes to reassert confidence once they return. This is where Ukraine gains strategic leverage without firing another drone. By sustaining pressure at a pace that outstrips public reporting, it forces Russian authorities into a dilemma. Continued transparency risks, revealing a growing and expensive problem. Silence, on the other hand, erodes trust and raises questions about what is being managed behind closed doors. Either choice imposes a penalty. The narrative space tightens, and the margin for believable messaging narrows. Over time, this dynamic reshapes how the campaign is perceived both domestically and externally. Control over the physical defense of airspace may remain intact, but control over the story becomes increasingly fragile. Information suppression stops being a tool of confidence and starts signaling uncertainty. The absence of figures speaks louder than confirmation ever could, because it suggests that the situation is still evolving faster than it can be framed. In prolonged conflicts, credibility is a strategic asset. Once strained, it is difficult to restore. By turning reporting cadence into a pressure point, Ukraine demonstrates that modern warfare extends beyond missiles and drones into the realm of timing, disclosure, and belief. The battlefield is no longer just above the capital, but within the space between what is known, what is admitted, and what is deliberately left unsaid. One of the most underestimated forms of damage in sustained high-intensity defense is not immediate failure, but maintenance debt. Radar arrays, missile launchers, and command systems are engineered with a specific operational philosophy in mind. They are designed for episodic engagement periods of heightened activity, followed by downtime for diagnostics, calibration, and repair. When those systems are forced into continuous use, they do not break all at once. Instead, they accumulate invisible wear that quietly reshapes their reliability profile over time. Constant radar operation generates heat stress, accelerates component fatigue, and shortens the lifespan of sensitive electronics. Missile systems experience mechanical strain through repeated readiness cycles, even when interceptors are not launched. Software systems designed to operate in bursts must now run without pause, increasing the likelihood of glitches, degraded performance, or misalignment between sensors and fire control units. None of this necessarily produces a dramatic failure that can be publicly acknowledged. The systems continue to function, but with narrowing tolerances and shrinking safety margins. As maintenance windows shorten, trade-offs emerge. Crews must choose between keeping systems operational for the next alert or taking them offline for inspection and servicing. Deferred maintenance becomes routine, not because it is safe, but because it is necessary to sustain immediate readiness. Over time, this creates a backlog of unresolved wear that compounds risk. Failure probability rises not in a straight line, but exponentially. As small, unaddressed issues begin interacting in unpredictable ways, this delayed damage has strategic implications. A defense network burdened by maintenance debt may appear robust on paper while becoming increasingly fragile in practice. When the next phase of pressure arrives, whether through higher tempo, different attack profiles, or simultaneous stressors, the system may encounter vulnerabilities it cannot rapidly correct. Ukraine does not need to force these failures now. By sustaining pressure, it shapes the conditions for future opportunity. In modern warfare, endurance is not just about surviving today's engagements, it is about preserving tomorrow's reliability. Maintenance debt turns time into a weapon, storing damage in advance. When that stored damage eventually surfaces, it does so without warning, creating windows of vulnerability that are far more dangerous than any single night of visible attack. The true strategic significance of this campaign lies not in physical destruction, but in geography of experience, where the war is felt rather than what it visibly damages. For decades, Moscow functioned as a psychologically insulated center of power. Authority radiated outward from the capital, while the consequences of war were absorbed elsewhere at the periphery. This separation reinforced a sense of permanence and control. The capital was not merely a command hub, it was a symbol of distance between decision and consequence. Persistent drone overflights quietly undermined that separation. When air defense systems activate above residential districts and sirens echo across the skyline, the capital transitions from observer to participant. Nothing needs to be destroyed for this shift to occur. The value lies in presence, not impact. Repeated alerts dissolve the illusion that power can remain untouched while force is applied outward. The psychological boundary that once protected the center begins to erode, replaced by uncertainty and anticipation. War no longer feels abstract or distant. It becomes part of the city's nightly rhythm. History suggests that when capitals lose their sense of sanctuary, strategic dynamics begin to shift. This does not mean immediate collapse or public panic. Instead, it alters how endurance is perceived. Leaders, institutions, and populations recalibrate their expectations when the center is no longer immune to disruption. The capital's role as a stabilizing constant weakens, and with it, the narrative of control that sustains prolonged conflict. What makes this approach especially potent is its subtlety. No iconic landmarks are targeted, no dramatic imagery dominates headlines, yet the cumulative effect is profound. Each overflight reinforces the idea that distance no longer guarantees safety and that power does not ensure insulation. The capital remains standing, functioning, and defended, but it is no longer untouched. This is how psychological frontlines form in modern war. They do not announce themselves with devastation. They emerge through repetition, through the steady normalization of intrusion into spaces once considered secure. When the center begins to feel what it once only directed, the balance between authority and endurance quietly changes, often long before the consequences become visible on a map. What makes this campaign strategically distinct is how deliberately it avoids the traditional triggers of escalation while still inflicting meaningful pressure. Ukraine is not striking iconic landmarks, not causing mass civilian casualties, and not producing dramatic visuals that would dominate headlines or force an immediate emotional response. This restraint is not accidental. It is a calculated effort to operate below escalation tripwires while steadily increasing the cost of defense. By doing so, Ukraine denies Russia the political and strategic justification for asymmetric retaliation, even as the cumulative burden continues to grow. In many wars, escalation is driven as much by symbolism as by damage. A single spectacular strike can provoke disproportionate response, harden public attitudes, and narrow diplomatic space. Ukraine's approach rejects that logic. Instead of shock and awe, it applies controlled erosion. Each drone forces a response. Each response costs money, attention, and endurance. None of it is visually decisive on its own, yet together it creates a persistent strain that cannot be ignored or easily countered. The pressure is real, but it remains ambiguous enough to limit Russia's options. This balance is crucial. Russia cannot simply choose not to respond, because even a single missed interception would carry unacceptable risk. At the same time, responding with escalation risks, validating the very pressure Ukraine is applying, and expanding the conflict in ways that may be strategically unfavorable. The result is a narrow corridor in which Russia must continue absorbing costs without clear justification for changing the rules of engagement. Ukraine, meanwhile, maintains initiative without crossing lines that would unify opposition or invite dramatic countermeasures. This is attrition without spectacle, erosion without rupture. It reflects a mature understanding of how modern conflicts are shaped not only by firepower, but by thresholds, narratives, and decision constraints. The absence of dramatic destruction is not a weakness of the strategy, it is its core strength. If you value objective analysis over noise and speculation, consider following this channel. We focus on how decisions are made and the changes those decisions bring about. This phase of the conflict reflects a fundamental shift in how victory is defined. Traditional measures, territory gained or lost, units destroyed, lines advanced, are largely absent from this campaign. Instead, success is measured through endurance imbalance. Ukraine is not trying to seize ground around Moscow or demonstrate battlefield dominance in the conventional sense. It is testing how long the city can afford to remain perfectly defended, night after night, without relief. The battlefield is no longer land or airspace alone, but sustainability itself. At the heart of this approach is a deceptively simple question. Can the defender afford to keep winning every night? Each interception is technically a success. Each alert confirms that the system works. Yet each success carries a cost that accumulates across finances, logistics, maintenance, and human endurance. Over time, those costs compound into strategic pressure. The defender survives, but survival itself becomes expensive. In this framework, resilience is no longer free. It must be paid for repeatedly. This logic reverses the usual assumptions of air defense. A system designed to prevent damage is now forced to absorb it indirectly. Ukraine does not need to breach the shield to undermine it. By compelling constant readiness, it transforms defense into a long-term liability. The question shifts from whether Moscow can stop drones today to whether it can sustain the burden of stopping them indefinitely. Endurance becomes the metric that matters most. Under this model, survival is no longer synonymous with advantage. Holding the line does not automatically favor the defender if the cost of holding it steadily erodes future capacity. The side that dictates tempo gains leverage, even without visible breakthroughs. Ukraine's campaign demonstrates that modern victory conditions can be subtle, incremental, and deeply strategic. Rather than chasing dramatic turning points, it focuses on reshaping the underlying balance of sustainability. When endurance breaks before defenses do, the outcome is decided long before any map visibly changes. When you step back from the technology and the headlines, the deeper lesson here is not really about drones or air defenses. It is about endurance, choices, and the quiet cost of always having to react. In life, as in conflict, winning a single moment does not always mean you are winning overall. Sometimes the greater danger lies in situations that force you to stay constantly alert, constantly responding, without time to rest, reflect, or recover. Many people reach a stage in life where the pressure does not come from dramatic crises, but from repetition, ongoing obligations, unresolved tensions, or routines that slowly drain energy and clarity. The lesson is that sustainability matters more than intensity. A path that looks manageable day by day can still become damaging if it never allows space to reset. Strength is not only about resilience, but about knowing when a pattern itself is unhealthy. There is also a reminder here about perspective. Real damage is often invisible at first. It shows up quietly through fatigue, stress, and diminishing joy rather than sudden collapse. Paying attention early before the cost becomes overwhelming can make the difference between maintaining control and slowly losing it. In the end, whether in nations or in personal lives, the question is not, can I handle this today? But can I afford to live like this indefinitely? Recognizing that difference is often the first step toward wiser decisions and a more balanced, enduring sense of stability.